we are not acknowledging the hot war in the Ukraine. We who are sitting in capitals in France and Paris and Berlin do not understand how worried people, for good reason, are feeling in the Baltic countries. And there's a deep instinct among the sort of transatlantic elite in Europe to think that things can't possibly change in the United States, that cooler heads will prevail. You know what, they're asking us to up to 2%. Perhaps we should be more worried about making provisions for our own defense, but in the end, the United States will always be there. We are now in a rapidly changing political world in which populists can take over governments, align themselves with governments that do not care about the liberal world order, that do not care even about the sanctity of the borders of sovereign territory in Europe, as in Russia. And we really have to start thinking about how to confront those threats, which come in forms like cyber warfare, as Molly was saying, but which also may mean that part of the European alliance is going to crumble. I don't think that anybody in Europe is asking themselves seriously enough a question of what happens if somebody like Marine Le Pen might win in France, or if populists end up winning in other countries, like, say, the Netherlands and so on. A lot of the idea for how we're going to defend ourselves in Europe is one of military cooperation, in which, to caricature a little bit, you know, the French bring the tanks and the Germans bring the planes, because famously we don't have any tanks, and the Dutch bring the field hospital and the Belgians bring the intelligence. Well, what happens if the government of the Netherlands is suddenly allied with Russia and they're not going to bring the field hospital because they refuse to take part in the mission? Well, then you basically have the populist's veto. The person who is least hostile to Russia, the person who is most comfortable with letting Russia run wild in Central Europe, can suddenly block any real joint European military action. So I think we have to think much more carefully about what European defense would look like if cooler heads will not prevail in Washington, D.C., and if some not so cool heads keep gaining power in other European countries as well.